Good morning, afternoon, evening to all of you. And once again, many thanks for your participation. We are honored to have Mauro Guillén as our opening speaker of our 35th Conference for Official Institutions. To be honest, I couldn't think of a better way to kick off our conference. Mauro is one of today's most innovative business scholars. He is a global markets trend expert who combines his training as a sociologist and a business economist to identify and quantify the most promising opportunities at the intersection of demographic, economic, and technological developments. His online courses on Coursera and edX have drawn over 100,000 students from all over the world, and his research has won him numerous awards, far too many to list here. His research, op-eds, and commentary have appeared in a variety of publications, including the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, as well as The Economist and the Financial Times. He has appeared on radio and television, including CNBC, CNN, and Bloomberg, among others. He's a seasoned public speaker, and he sits on a number of advisory boards of directors and nonprofit boards of trustees. He's dean of the Cambridge Judge Business School and a fellow of Queen's College at the University of Cambridge. And previously, he was at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. Today, we'll focus on his Wall Street Journal best-selling book, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything. It is a pleasure and an honor to have Marco here with us as we begin our conference. And after reading the book, I believe that only a small number of people on the planet could have undertaken the enormous task of piecing together such disparate and seemingly unconnected subjects and bringing them all together in a cohesive narrative of what we should expect for this decade, which already appeared to be challenging enough in January 2020, and now appears to have been further magnified by the pandemic. But before we begin, Mauro, I wanted to express how moved I was by a section in your book titled From Bilbao to Pittsburgh, in which you describe the transformation that Bilbao underwent at the turn of the century. My parents are originally from Bilbao and migrated to Venezuela, where I was born. And as a young boy in the 1970s, I spent my summers in Bilbao with my grandparents, and I very much related to your depiction of it back then as a dark, dirty, and frankly, depressing place. And then in the early 2000s, when I returned to see my uncles, cousins, and childhood friends, I found myself wondering, what on earth happened to this place? Because it was truly a transformation. So thank you so much for bringing those memories back. And I don't know if perhaps you would like to comment a bit on that before we get going into the flow of the book itself, Mauro.
Iker, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for your kind words of introduction. And yes, some cities, declining cities that essentially were suffering from job losses due to the shutting down of particularly manufacturing industry, have managed to bounce back. This has happened in Europe. This has happened in the United States. Unfortunately, not all cities have managed to do so. And as you know, they, even to this day, have deep pockets of poverty. But Bilbao is one of those successful transformations, a city that wasn't really well known outside of Spain before the Guggenheim Museum arrived. And with it, tourism and new investments, and essentially, led, as you mentioned, to a wholesale transformation of the city. So it's really has become a textbook example, by the way, widely imitated. A lot of other cities around the world have tried to enlist a famous architect like Frank Gehry to design and build an iconic building. But no city has succeeded using that approach as much as Bilbao.
Well, so many thanks once again. I mean, it was really, very personal to me, that memory. And as we will probably get into the conversation, it is a great example of what you refer in your book as lateral thinking. So I'm sure we'll come back to that. But maybe before, just try to get into the flow of the book. I think that the audience would appreciate you telling them how this 2030 book came to be. What is it that you were hoping to accomplish, and in general, what the book is about, Mauro?
So the book came out, as you know, in August of 2020, and I started writing it 7 years earlier, so probably around the year 2013. And the reason I decided to write the book was to provide people with a roadmap, to provide people with a guide as to how to navigate all of these transformations in the world. Before I wrote or started to write the book, I was making a lot of presentations, both at the Wharton School and also elsewhere, about the state of the world, about change in the world, change in the economy, changes in politics and geopolitics, changes in technology. And I was getting this sense from my audiences that they were very concerned about the future. Remember, 2013 was 3 or 4 years after the big global financial crisis. And it was also a time when the consequences of the crisis were still being felt very strongly in Europe. And so there was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety on the part of people. And so I decided to start doing research for it. And slowly but surely, the main themes emerged. And I realized along the way that the best way or the best approach to all of these large scale transformations would be to, in the beginning, think about population, think about demographics. So as you know, 3 or 4 chapters in the book have to do with population changes. Because at the end of the day, every consumer market, every financial market, every country in the world, the dynamics of population, they don't determine everything. I'm not going to argue that. But they do have a large impact on what is possible and what is not possible. And they also present some challenges and some opportunities. So I decided then to devote the first third or so of the book to population. And then I got into something that I think is absolutely fundamental for us to understand, which is that up until 20 or 30 years ago, if you remember, Iker, most of the middle class in the world was in Europe or the United States. Well, Latin America has always had somewhat of a middle class, but most of it was in Europe and the United States. But as you know, this has completely changed over the last few years. And now we're entering a situation in which most of the middle class, a majority of the middle class in the world, will be in Asia. And that is phenomenally important because the middle class is the foundation of the economy. And the middle class is also, in principle, the foundation of social stability and even democracy, I would argue. So in other words, huge transformations from the point of view of population, from the point of view of the growth of middle class. And then, of course, I had to include chapters in the book, and that's the third part of it, about technology. Because technology is, in fact, changing everything. And it's not just digital technologies or platforms, such as the one that we're using right now, but it's pretty much everything from 3D printing to nanotechnologies, virtual reality, the genome, and so on and so forth. So I think it is the combination of these 3 major forces, population, middle class, technology, that is really changing the world beyond recognition.
Okay, well, thank you for that synopsis. So maybe getting a bit into the demographics and these kind of elements, you begin your book by saying follow the babies. and indeed, the trends that you describe in develop and developing, and the challenges and opportunities that come from those massive shifts are really transformational. And you argue that they are already in motion, and we will likely see very significant changes, within the decade. So maybe if you can expand a bit on that notion.
Yeah, follow the babies is a methodology for trying to anticipate the future. And the logic is essentially that the consumers, the investors, the workers, also the citizens more broadly of the future, are the babies that have been born over the last 10, 20 years, and the ones that will be born over the next 10 years. So if you focus your attention on the number of babies being born in different parts of the world, what are their characteristics, how likely are they to access a good education, and so on and so forth, you can anticipate, broadly based trends that are likely to happen in the world. And it's not just about the number of babies, it's also that itself, is that the number of babies also has an impact on the age distribution of the population. If you have a lot of babies, then the population in the future is going to be young. But if you don't have a large number of babies, then the population is going to get older very quickly into the future. And so these changes in the age distribution of the population, which, as you know, are happening at different speeds, in different ways, in different parts of the world, they also have a huge impact on consumer markets, on financial markets, on geopolitics. They're of fundamental importance, I think, for us to understand.
Okay. So one part you mentioned on this shifting, and one idea that does come into my mind, and you take it from the point of view of the consumer, but also it has some geopolitical implications on, and then there is the rise of China, and particularly Africa, and the challenges for development and so on. And one thing, going back to the consumer thesis that you explore in the book, is that you do mention that you were willing to bet your entire pension fund into how the importance of these new markets will begin to dictate how society and the consumer and corporations follow and begin paying more attention to these new markets. So that's a notion that I found extremely interesting.
No, absolutely. I'm sure we'll have time to talk more specifically about China, but in general, the rise of emerging markets means that the center of gravity of the global economy is shifting. It means that more than half of consumption will be in those emerging markets as opposed to Europe and the United States. And it means also that the rules of competition will increasingly be written by companies and by governments in that part of the world. Because the very basic principle here is that the rules of competition are written by the largest markets, not by the smallest markets. And so we are witnessing right now a changing of the guard kind of moment in which Europe and the United States are no longer going to be in combination the largest market area in the world, but rather that it will be shifting towards Asia. Now, Asia, of course, is a very, very heterogeneous continent, but we have some really, really large emerging markets there, like China and India. And then you also have ASEAN, this bloc with 700 million people, including countries such as Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, and so on and so forth, which is also a major consumer market, which is rapidly integrating as well. So I think what we need to grasp is that from the point of view of the geography of consumption in the world, you and I were born into a situation in which that geography revolves around the North Atlantic Ocean, Europe and the United States. And that now is changing very, very quickly.
Excellent, Mauro, sorry. So another notion that you explore in the book is the notion of equality and talk about migration and women ascending as not only in the corporate world but also as on the wealth front. So maybe you can share a bit on your perspectives on those two issues.
So when it comes to wealth, as you know, what has been going on in the world is a process of accumulation of wealth. So the rich are getting richer. This has, of course, increased inequality. And this is becoming a political problem as well as an economic one. Now, I would like to highlight, though, two dimensions of wealth accumulation that I think are really important to keep in mind. The first one is age. So most of the wealth in the world is owned by people above the age of 60. And that's, of course, because people tend to accumulate net worth as they grow older, as they pay down debts, as the assets that they own, such as their homes, increase in value. And the other second very important dimension regarding this accumulation of wealth is by gender. So what we have seen over the last 20, 30 years, first in Europe and the United States, and then in other parts of the world as well, is that women have been accumulating wealth faster than men. For two reasons. One is that women, as you know, in an increasing number of countries in the world have better access to education. And that access to education gives them better job opportunities. And therefore, women now have opportunities to work and to make money that didn't exist before their time. And then secondly, women live longer than men on average, right? Depending on the country, between 4 and 7 years longer than men. So therefore, not only women have more time to accumulate wealth, but they also are more likely to inherit. So in other words, what we're seeing is not just a process of wealth accumulation, which is in and of itself a very important development, but we're also seeing, quite importantly, a shift in terms of the kinds of people who are accumulating wealth.
Okay, well, Marco, another point that you make that I found extremely interesting is on the grain. I think you call it the gray market in the book, and how this represents a shift on what it means to be gray these days, and just the sheer numbers in different places, how that affects society, the consumer, companies, governments, the voters, and so on. So I think there's a lot there, but I think you do a terrific job tackling the issue.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, because we have fewer babies over time, but we had a lot of babies 60 years ago. Then the population above the age of 60 is expanding very quickly. And it's expanding in absolute numbers, but it's also expanding relatively speaking. So in other words, beginning with Japan, we're seeing that 35% or more of the population is now above the age of 60. So what has been going on in Japan will very soon also happen in China, in Europe, in the United States, and in Latin America, by the way, in that order, right? With just a little of a delay. And essentially what this means is that for the first time, the largest consumer segment defined by age is going to be people above the age of 60. Now think about the consequences of that. So up until now, most brands, most companies have been paying attention fundamentally to consumers in their 20s, their 30s, maybe their 40s. Most of the attention has been given to those groups. Most products and services are designed with those groups of people in mind. But now, no brand or company that would like to grow, would like to be successful in the market can ignore people above the age of 60. So that's what I call the gray consumer. It's a consumer that has purchasing power, although there are inequities within that group. And as you said, it's a consumer that is different from the notion of a 60-year-old or a 65-year-old or a 70-year-old that we used to have. Because now people in their 60s, in their 70s, and so on, they stay in much better physical and mental shape than people of the same age 20 or 40 or 50 years ago. So in other words, I mean, what I think is important to keep in mind is that not only life expectancy has grown, right? So we're living longer, but also the so-called health span has grown, meaning the number of years that we remain healthy. And so I think companies need to change the way they think about these consumers above the age of 60, because they are not the type of consumers above the age of 60 that existed in the world 20 or 40 years ago.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the book has an incredible amount of subjects of interest, and maybe we can shift gears now to some on the technology components, and then after that we can talk a bit about climate and so on. And on the technology front, one reference that you made that really got me to think, and I even had to Google it, I recognized, was that you were comparing what we are living now to the Cambrian Explosion. So maybe if you could explain to the audience, so they don't have to Google it, and why you compare this time with such a dramatic period in evolutionary biology.
Well, the Cambrian Explosion, as you know, took place many millions of years ago. And essentially, that's when the first complex organisms, organic beings came into existence. Most of those species, of course, are long extinct. But it was a moment, by a moment, of course, I mean in evolutionary time, right? So spanning several million years, where you had this explosion in terms of new forms of life emerging. And of course, I'm using the metaphor today, not for millions of years of change, but rather for what has been going on, and I think will continue to go on for the last 10 years, will continue into the next 10 years, which is this proliferation of technological breakthroughs. Not so much in terms of basic science, although we've had some of those, like the human genome, but more importantly, in terms of the applications of technology, especially through entrepreneurship. So the same way that during the Cambrian Explosion, you had new organisms becoming more innovative, more entrepreneurial, and developing new features, and so on and so forth, we see today this explosion in startups and new ideas, which of course are, some of them giving us new opportunities, offering us a better life, but others are also proving to be very disruptive, and they're destroying jobs and so on and so forth. So like in the Cambrian Explosion, we see that there's both creation and destruction, which is what, evolution has always brought, right? So I think, quite frankly, the way to think about the situation today is that we're going through all of these changes, and the changes are really monumental in scope and in scale. And they're affecting every aspect of our lives. I mean, who would have thought, Iker, just 20 years ago, that nowadays we would be learning, we would be working, we would be entertaining ourselves, we would be shopping, we would be even, finding other people to meet over some kind of a screen, either on our phone or a tablet or a laptop. I don't think anybody anticipated that 20 years ago, but this has fundamentally reshaped the way we live our lives.
I think with that, you opened the door to a very important question for the audience, and that we also have in agenda, which for the overall conference, which is the future of work. But more broadly, is the future of education, the future of health, and so on. So, I mean, and perhaps a related question that we are getting from the audience is that you wrote the book before the pandemic, and you did include a small chapter at the end as it was just beginning to unfold. But if you had had the chance to publish in 2021 instead of 2020, what new directions or changes or additional things would you have included in the book?
So I would say I wrote most of the book before the pandemic started, but the pandemic started in March of 2020, and the book came out in August. So I was able to make some changes to the book inside of the chapters, but also I added an epilogue at the end of the book. But you see, this pandemic, COVID-19, Iker, I think what's really important for us to understand is that it's not the type of crisis that puts things on hold. It's not the kind of crisis that reverses pre-existing trends. Quite on the contrary, it's a crisis that accelerates pre-existing trends. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples. The most obvious example is technology. So consumers, workers of all ages have accelerated the use of technology as a result of the pandemic, out of necessity, of course. But also this process of population aging that I was referring to a moment ago. Well, the pandemic has also accelerated that. And some people may think that this is completely counterintuitive, and it is, because obviously the pandemic has increased mortality. But the pandemic has also had the effect of young couples around the world postponing having babies. And that always happens when there's such a big shock to the system, when there's so much uncertainty, in this case, as a result of a public health emergency that then very quickly, of course, mutated into a major economic crisis with people losing their jobs. Whenever there is so much uncertainty, young people put their plans on hold regarding having babies. And so, for example, in the United States, during the year 2020, 300,000 fewer babies than expected were born because of the pandemic, right? So what I'm trying to say is that this is a pandemic that accelerates change. I think, by the way, it has also accelerated the rise of emerging markets in Asia, because they have been, generally speaking, much better at handling the effects of the pandemic than we have in Europe or in Latin America in particular. So, once again, it's a pandemic that has accelerated things. So my only regret, Iker, to tell you the truth, is that now that things are happening faster and earlier, the title of the book perhaps should be 2030. It should be 2028.
Wow, how about that? Well, one thing, I mean, on this future of work and so on, that comes to me is that you're you've been newly appointed as the dean of the Georgia Business School at Cambridge, and then you have to grasp with the future of education. How transformational you think the changes will be, or is this going to be more incremental? How do you view this? And I think that answer can translate into many other things in society.
Well, look, I think the pandemic marks a before and an after, especially for the education sector. Because as you know, schools, universities, they're always very slow to change and to adapt. But because of the pandemic, we all had to adjust very quickly. And in particular, we had to move online many of our activities. Now, in the process of doing so, I believe that teachers and professors, also the staff, have learned new capabilities. And we have found that perhaps a blended model of education, one that combines face-to-face and online learning, is a good option. But in any event, I think what the pandemic has shown is that online education is not a second best. It's not a poor cousin, so to speak, of face-to-face education in the classroom. That there is value in online education, and that some people, especially at certain points in life, they prefer to be able to learn online as opposed to having to move, having to disrupt their lives. So I think what we've learned is that technology can play a very important role. And I would take this argument one step further and say that when we're talking here about educating young people, these younger generations, they don't learn in the way that you and I learn. They like technology-mediated learning. And so I hope that educational institutions will change this time around, because otherwise we're going to miss a very important train. And by the way, as you know, also a lot of private, in many cases for-profit platforms are emerging to offer educational services. So if we don't do it, the traditional institutions don't do it, then entrepreneurs will do it.
Okay, well, let's see how that plays out by 2030. But well, maybe back on technology. I mean, time is running fast, and I have so many things to ask, and I'm bringing those into the conversation as we speak. The comments or questions from the audience, but then on the technology side, you cover a lot of ground as well. You talk about AI, Internet of Things, and Internet of Value, blockchain, and more currencies than countries and so on. But perhaps to begin with, you do make some comments on, well, actually, you quote some comments by Turing and by Hawkins on what AI means for humanity and so on, which, coming from such bright figures, they are kind of troubling. But if you can spend a bit of time on how you see AI playing out, and the benefits and dangers at this respect.
Well, AI is already a reality. Companies, governments, the military, they're all using AI. AI is, of course, a very heterogeneous set of tools that essentially enable computers to learn how to make decisions, right? Or how to adapt to whatever is going on. You can use data to train computers to do things that up until now only human beings could do, like recognize a face or drive a vehicle in the middle of traffic through a downtown area. And so AI has the potential, of course, of improving our lives, because they can make our lives simpler, more efficient, safer. But let's not forget, like every other kind of technology, AI also has the potential of putting people out of work, of destroying jobs. There will be a lot of people who will lose their jobs, or will see their job radically changed as a result of AI applications. So we're in the middle of a big revolution, and we still don't know where this is going to end. I do believe that there will be space for human beings and human brains to play a role. But the revolution that is going on in the area of AI is very real.
Well, that's part of the Cambrian explosion that you commented. So
absolutely,
and yeah, on the blockchain and currencies, digital. We will have a session on decentralized finance, and you do talk about this theme extensively in your book about pretty much a tokenization of everything, and how that changes value and perhaps overall systems. This is also a nascent. I wouldn't say nascent technology, but it hasn't gained broad adoption across many use cases. But you do expand quite a bit on the potential for blockchain and similar technologies. So if you could comment on that.
Well, blockchain, I think, has already being used in many domains, and this is only going to increase. So the blockchain, of course, it is this digital registry that was first designed to handle Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency. And it has certain characteristics, especially its distributed nature, that make it very appealing in terms of trying to organize the economy and transactions in the economy in a very different way. Up until now, as you know, we have a lot of human intervention when it comes to contracts, when it comes to ensuring that contractual clauses are met. So, for example, the supply contract between two companies, or a contract between a company and an individual. And blockchain is this a radical new way of thinking about how to keep track of everything that goes on in the economy. where there are multiple parties involved, at least two of them. And it, I think, has the potential of making the economy more efficient. It has the potential of essentially reducing transaction costs. And it can be, applied to so many different kinds of things, not just to buy-sell transactions, but also to record keeping, to voting, the protection of endangered species, incentives, creating incentives for people not to emit as many carbon emissions and therefore reduce the impact of climate change. So there's so many applications. But once again, like with AI, we find ourselves in a similar situation. It can improve our lives, but it can also destroy a lot of jobs, middle management jobs. People who right now, what they're doing is, for example, checking on those contracts and whether the contractual clauses are being met. So I think the combination of blockchain and what has been called smart contracts, so digital contracts, I think that's going to be or generate a huge transformation in the economy.
Well, yes, and then if you also include the the thesis that you mentioned in the book, that there are going to be more sensors than eyeballs and more computers than humans and so on, and then if you put AI and blockchain and so on, it grows even more puzzling how to evolve that. Those are huge challenges for society in general, policymakers and education and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. But again, what we need to understand regarding all of these technological developments is that we cannot just let them happen, because inevitably there will be beneficial outcomes, but not for everybody. There will also be people who are hurt, people who don't benefit as much as other people from all of these transformations.
Okay. Maybe another subject that you cover, and we also have a session on that. We have a session on the future of money. And you have a chapter in the book that I think goes sort of by the title from Marco Polo and Kublai Khan to the blockchain. And I found that narrative to be extremely enticing. And then you make the argument that before the central banks as we know them, it was common to have more currencies than countries, and then that paradigm changed, and you argue that it's likely to, well, more than likely, it's about to change, or it has already changed for good. But that poses many challenges, I would say, to the establishment, if you will, the current institutions, central banks, and so on. How do you see this playing out?
Well, I think there is scope for cryptocurrencies to play a role in the global economy. I don't think any one of them will become so dominant that they will displace the dollar or the renminbi, for the very simple reason that I think both the Federal Reserve and the People's Bank of China will end up launching a digital dollar and a digital renminbi, respectively, and the same will go for the euro. So I think in the end, what we're going to see is that we're going to have an infrastructure in place for digital currencies, but that we're going to have within that infrastructure various options. We're going to have government-issued cryptocurrencies, and we're also going to have private cryptocurrencies, or cryptocurrencies that are completely decentralized and driven by an algorithm like Bitcoin. So we're going to see a tremendous an explosion of different kinds of options for consumers. So I think that's going to be good. But I do not believe that cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, for example, are going to take over the world.
Then if you include the central banks coming up with their own versions of these cryptocurrencies, so-called CBDCs, and then that can have vast effects in the financial market as we know it. Do you think that that's going to happen, or how do you see this playing out?
Sorry, forgive me, Iker, but I didn't quite understand the question.
Yeah, well, if central banks issue their own currencies, and then they don't really need the financial system, because ultimately, people can have their money at the central bank. I mean, where do
on the
banks
blockchain,
and other...
Yeah. Well, that could be one of the consequences of digital currencies on the blockchain issued by central banks, in the sense that this technology will do away with many intermediaries. So I wonder what Visa and MasterCard are going to do, right? But you see, that's why banks and payments companies like Visa and MasterCard, they're investing in this technology. They're studying it. They're trying to position themselves in a way that they can benefit from this wave of innovation. I think it's really, really important for all of us to keep in mind that, one thing is what's good for the economy, what's good for people as they consider different options for managing their money. And quite another is who's going to help people and companies move money around, get credit, and so on and so forth. And that, I think, this second aspect is what's at stake right now.
Okay. Maybe I'm going to paraphrase a question we received from the audience that goes by, the effect of artificial intelligence in unemployment. And you did mention some of that, but then perhaps a thesis that I would like to explore with you is, the planet, as you well mentioned, is not heterogeneous, and there are different, different places working different ways, and developed countries that can have these concentrating these technologies and so on can leave the world behind. You do talk about platforms and effects in equality or inequality and so on. That's
well, I think it is true that technology is creating gaps and is benefiting some people versus others. And we see this playing out within countries, within the US, within Latin American countries, within European countries, and so on and so forth. But you're raising another issue, which is whether rich countries will just continue to surge ahead of smaller, poorer countries because technologies that they develop. And that may be, oftentimes the case, but it's not always the case. So, for example, take mobile telecommunications technology, smartphones, or just simply phones, mobile phones. Arguably, this has changed life and has changed companies, everything, everywhere in the world. But having said that, consider Africa, which is not the most developed part of the world. And as you know, in Africa, mobile phones have been essential in terms of providing an infrastructure for mobile payments and for telemedicine, out of necessity, because in Africa, if you remember, they have no ATMs, no automatic teller machines. They have very few banks. They don't have enough doctors, especially in the rural areas. And so what I'm trying to say is that clearly, some technologies have the potential of improving the lives of people in the poorest parts of the world. And I think that's something that we should welcome.
Well, we are running out of time, and I have still plenty of questions, but maybe one notion that you go over and over in your book is the idea of lateral thinking. It's a leitmotif across the book. So if you could share with us your thinking at that respect.
Yes, so forgive me for the lighting, but it is getting dark here in the UK. As you know, the latitude is quite low. So look, lateral thinking is all about connecting the dots. The point of my book is that if you consider population trends in isolation of economic trends or in isolation of technological trends, then you're not going to be able to understand what's going on, right? Because these things come together, they converge. That's why we're getting so much change. That's why, going back to the metaphor, we are in a Cambrian kind of moment, because all of these things are converging, right? And they are generating a huge transformation. So lateral thinking is all about how you need to essentially try to look for the connections across these trends, right? So for example, technology is right now interacting with population aging big time. So for example, it's changing retirement because a lot of people, especially knowledge workers, prior to the availability of these digital platforms, were not interested in working. They didn't want to commute to the office. They didn't want to, have to be there from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. in the afternoon. But now digital platforms and the so-called gig economy is giving them other options, more flexible. And they're finding that it probably makes sense for them to work or to continue working at least part-time. So in this example, I've been connecting different kinds of trends, right? Or connecting the dots across these trends to truly understand what I think is going to be one of the most important transformations in the near future.
Okay. Well, one subject we haven't spoken about is climate change, and we do have a session after this on that subject. And in particular, well, we know that we are currently, or it's currently undergoing the Glasgow COP26 meeting. And one thing I came across in your book is the tragedy of the commons in general. But it was in the book more towards perhaps a very specific communal elements, and I was wondering if what we're seeing climate-wise, it's a tragedy of the commons. Some players using up in an unfair way the resources available to us. So what?
Yeah, I mean, I think the tragedy of the commons helps explain why for so long we haven't really tackled climate change. Nobody wants to take responsibility. Everybody wants to get away with it because, of course, it is cheaper to pollute than it's not. It is cheaper to emit carbon emissions. Although, as you know, some sources of power now, like solar and wind, have become competitive in cost, at least with coal. So I think the problem with climate change has many dimensions to it. You have the energy dimension, but you also have the what I call the consumption dimension. So meaning that as consumers, I think all over the world, we have become too wasteful. And we are essentially, asking the economy to produce a lot of goods and services that in the end we really don't need. And so I think the fight against climate change has to be about an energy transition away from fossil fuels for sure. But it also has to be about a consumer or consumption transition away from all of the waste. We waste about a third of the food that reaches the end consumer, and the agricultural sector, including both production and distribution, is the single largest contributor to carbon emissions. But we're wasting 30% of what we produce. So there's so much that we need to do. And I think technological breakthroughs, I think incentives, but I think also behavioral change. You quoted Daniel Kahneman, or somebody that quoted Daniel Kahneman at the beginning of the session. And, I think we need to think carefully about how psychology can help us introduce the right incentives, the right nudges, so that people then do the right thing.
Well, Mauro, we really are getting close to the end, but one thing that I really enjoyed about the book is your, immense sense of optimism. It's like okay, so there are great challenges, but if we get together and get the right mindset, we can do it. And you talk about the notion of keeping your options open and real options, and that's I think it's a very well way to go about these so challenging issues. If you could share your thoughts at that respect, maybe on a closing basis.
Well, the thought that I would like to share is that I think we need in the world many different kinds of things. We need cooperation, we need collaboration, governments talking to one another, companies thinking not only about their own profits, but more broadly about what's good for society. But as individuals, we also need to change. We also need to adjust. We also need to think about the consequences of our actions on a daily basis, right? And, I hope that my book actually helps people understand how interconnected everything is and how quickly things are changing, and that, yes, we can take advantage of the opportunities embedded in those changes, but there's also threats and there's also issues that we need to address. So that's what I would emphasize, about the book and the message that it sends. Iker, you're muted.
Okay, I guess I was muted. So let me comment this. No, I was saying that we have to be wrapping up the session, and there's just so little time and so many things to talk about on your predictions. But I would like to express our appreciation to you for making time in your busy agenda. Also would like to thank Rodrigo and Invesco for their assistance in bringing you to us today. And it's been a pleasure, Mauro. We owe you a debt of gratitude. And on behalf of FLAR and our audience and Latin America as a whole, thank you so incredibly much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure. And best of luck for the rest of the conference.
Thank you so much. And to the audience, I will be rejoining in about 10 minutes with climate change. So please stay tuned. So thank you once again, Mauro.
Okay, thank you.